right, a very good morning to everyone here in the room and also online. My name is Andrzej Błachowicz. I am the CEO of Climate Strategies. For those of you who don't know us, we are an international organization that brings together research and policymaking to solve key issues of our times. And of course, transition away of fossil fuels is one of them. There's no even need to explain why. So this is the seminar, Tackling Oil and Gas Expansion Through Just Transitions, Pathways for Net Zero and Phase Out. This event is hosted by us, Climate Strategies, together with Stockholm Environment Institute, also in partnership with the Stanley Center for Peace and Security. Many thanks to those organizations. I wanted to also acknowledge funding for this event and the project Oil and Gas Transition by KR Foundation and Laudes Foundation. Thank you so much for your support over the past 2 years. So this event marks the end of the current phase of the project. So let's move to the next slide. Oh, sorry, I should be doing that myself. You see, yeah, it's working. So we have quite a busy agenda. The first panel will be the presentations from our 3 countries from the North Sea region, so Norway, Denmark, and the UK. Then we have insights from US oil and gas transition. Then we have a presentation that looks about global fossil fuel transition pathways and anchoring that in science. Then the reason this is in gray is because unfortunately we get a cancellation from Mr. Hart last night, which is very unfortunate. On the other hand, we've had very good interaction with the Secretary General Office, and we want to continue that offline, really with that message of how can initiatives like this be helpful to shape the UN climate agenda for the years to come. And I think this is really even more critical than sort of one-off events. So we are looking forward to that engagement. Of course, we are very sad that Selvin couldn't be with us. And then we close our event with Sean Bradley from BOGA to talk about the international collaboration. One thing I want to say, a little apology that the first panel will be male only. We really tried to have it more balanced. I think overall the event is quite balanced, but yeah, that was the sort of dictated by the availability of the panelists. As a punishment, we asked them to stay at home. Sorry, it's just like the joke. Right. One thing also to say for people online, please use the Q&A function. And we will try to allow a couple of questions here and there. However, the agenda is quite packed. One thing my notes are telling me to say is that the event is being recorded. So this is on-record event. People can, join in at any time, and the recording will be available later on for those who couldn't make it. Right. So this is maybe a few words about our initiative. Some of you have engaged with us over the past 2 years, but some have not. And that's also the purpose why this event was being made public, so that people we didn't interact with so far could join us, engage, and benefit from our research. So this is Oil and Gas Transition Initiative, has been in existence for 2 years, and has been researching sustainable pathways for transition away from oil and gas in the 3 North Sea countries. And we've been working with in-country partners, and you'll hear from them later on. In Norway, it's University of Oslo, Fafo, and Fridtjof Nansen Institute. In the UK, it's University of Edinburgh, and then in Denmark, it's Aalborg University. So many thanks for everything you guys have done as part of the project. Obviously, the selection of North Sea, it's because there is a common perception that this is the kind of a candidate for a front runner, and I won't spoil the show, because you'll hear from Felipe and colleagues whether it is a good case or not a good case, but it's really an interesting case study to research 3 countries in 1 region. And I think there are a bunch of lessons for more countries and for other places who intend to transition, or we want them to intend to transition away from oil and gas. The 3 pillars of our approach, and I think this is really crucial, and you'll see that throughout the event. One is our mission is to be evidence-based, to be based on science, based on facts. So that's at the core of every project Climate Strategies is involved in. The other one is pluralistic. It means we invited all the actors to the table, from colloquially saying the cleanest one to the dirtiest one, hoping that through our project, the middle ground will shift. And that also meant that we play a role of this trusted neutral convener. And finally, catalyzing. So that means we want the research to be impactful, useful. We want the conclusions to be plugged in the policy processes in what is happening in the real world. So you'll see that some of the, well, most of the scenarios we presented were so-called co-produced. So that means we conducted several consultations with stakeholders. In some countries, you'll see that the project contributed to sort of a new era of stakeholder engagement. I don't know whether Kacper will confirm that, but hopefully he will. This is just to say that, of course, we all know that there are various definitions of just transition. If I was to summarize it in one sentence, I would say that our interpretation of that for the purpose of the project was we wanted to search distributive fairness in every scenario we were presenting. And of course, this is, some of you are familiar, the 7 principles for just transition developed by our fellow co-lead of the initiative, Stockholm Environment Institute. So the 7 principles are quite comprehensive. They talk about active pursuit of decarbonization, avoidance of lock-ins, supporting the regions, but not only the regions from the sort of administrative point of view, also the communities, workers, families, then the polluter pays, so clean your damage, then social and economic inequalities, so more systemic issue, and finally the process governance of transition. So this was at the heart of our project. And of course, as I said, I appreciate that there are lots of various definitions and there's no right or wrong one out there. This is a bit of advertisement. So because we are coming to the end of this phase of the project, I invite you to go to the website, oilandgastransitions.org, and you'll find all our reports that we have produced over the past 2 years. The top left are what we had done in the first year, which was basically like challenges, opportunities, almost like a portrait of all those 3 countries. Then the bottom left is the co-produced scenarios, and you see that they are very different questions for each country, and rightly so, because we obviously discover that each of them has a different challenge to tackle. And finally, freshly released, the kind of closing of paper that summarizes everything and has lots of lessons moving forward. Felipe will talk about it. This is an important slide because, of course, you know, we produced the reports at certain moments. So, for instance, 2021, that was the first wave of the reports. That was before the Russian aggression of Ukraine. So obviously the context has changed. And, you know, each report in this space, each report that is published today, tomorrow, it may be a bit out of date. And I think the life is, that's how dynamic our life is. So obviously with this event, we didn't want to say, oh, here are the researchers presenting the reports. We wanted to just give you also a interpretation and response to some of the most recent developments. And of course, this illustrates that all those developments have been quite alarming, which is basically from wherever you look, there have been announcements of new licenses, new production plants, and so on, so on. So that's also the reason why we wanted to have present to you a picture of the United States in that context, which for whatever reason, I thought it's missing in many discussions. People just lack basic knowledge. There is just like high political perception of US, but there's not enough detailed conversation on what's going on in the country. And obviously also to say that the COP host, United Arab Emirates, have also announced incredible plans for more oil and gas production. So this is the context for why we wanted to debunk this myth that, you know, more production could be compatible. We are actually obviously saying that even to keep the existing production is totally incompatible with what we need to do to save our planet. Is that the end? Yes. So this is basically, I'm just going to leave you and ask all our presenters with this question. So throughout the project, we were arguing that just transition is the enabler. Through just transition, we can achieve much more, faster, and we can achieve it in this fair way. So some of the presentations, hopefully we answer that. I hope maybe even all, but I'll ask you to focus on how can that be done, right? Because I think nobody contests that just, this role of just transition, but yeah, the practicalities of implementation, practicalities of applying those lessons on the ground is the key. So that's what we want to present throughout this event. And just to say that I'm planning to allow for questions from this room and also maybe from Q&A later on. And let's see how it goes. I don't have like a proper bear, but I'll be making this little sound if you have 1 minute left in your presentation, because yeah, we don't want to talk too long. We also would like to have a nice exchange. So I think now I can give the floor. Right, Adri, I can give the floor to Norway, correct? Yes, so we will start with our panel from Oil and Gas Transition Project. So the first one will be the view from Norway. Kacper Szulecki, who is a research professor in international climate governance and the institution called NUPI, one of the key participants of our project. So Kacper, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Just share my screen and hope that it works. Can you see the slides now? Sorry. Does it work? I hope so. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present our research, and I'm very grateful to both the organizers and the audience in New York. Also for this opportunity to do it in a hybrid mode, a more climate-friendly mode. I wish I was there with you, but I think we agree that it's in our joint best interest that I'm not. I will be looking at Norway, which I dare say is a critical case in our project, in the sense that it's both the most important oil and gas producer in the region, and also because of the importance of fossil fuel revenues for the country's welfare, share of GDP, employment, and all those things, making it a kind of a difficult case for transition and perhaps a crucial case for a just transition. However, as you can see from the title, there are still questions looming: just transition or just a widening gap in terms of emissions. While there's talk of a just transition, what we are observing actually right now is still increasing production, as Andrzej has already said. My presentation draws on 2 of our reports. That's almost 100 pages, or 2 pages of executive summaries if you don't have the time, but I do encourage you to have a look at the source material. So, as noted, the oil and gas sector is a major source of revenue and of welfare in Norway, and it's also the major polluter. So 28% of the country's greenhouse gas emissions, only counted on Norwegian territory, come from the sector. If you included exported emissions in terms of oil and gas that is being used and burned elsewhere, of course, that's much more. However, as you can see from this graph, however you look at it, production of oil and gas is not falling. It's actually rising. There's new licenses being issued, and in 2021 there was a parliamentary election. The incoming government head, Jonas Gahr Støre, said that it is wise for Norway to continue exploring in developed areas, so those areas that are already, well, possess the right infrastructure. It is still controversial whether Norway will move beyond what is already known and documented or not, but still even this is not compatible with the country's Paris Agreement targets. So a long-term strategy for the phasing out of oil and gas in Norway requires upfront investment in alternative activities, something that can replace oil and gas as a source of revenue and a source of employment. This means moving financial resources out of a very well-known and also very, very profitable sector into something that is still unknown and most likely much less profitable. So the decision is very difficult politically. A gradual decline in investment in oil and gas and a gradual increase in public support for new greener activities is needed and is, of course, likely over time, but will it be quick enough? Let's see. Apart from the general desktop research that Andrzej also mentioned, we did some exercises in terms of scenario building with a variety of Norwegian stakeholders. We asked them to consider two scenarios. One was reaching net zero, the other was oil and gas sector phase out. Here you can see some ideas coming from the net zero scenario. So let's emphasize that there is broad acceptance for a net zero vision among mainstream political parties, companies, trade unions. Everybody seems to be on the same page. However, how this is going to be reached, I mean, a lot of strong faith in technological solutions, especially offshore wind and carbon capture and storage, making Norway a hub for carbon storage sequestration, and reliance on demand side economics and transition technologies. Technologies that are still either quite expensive or highly hypothetical, like CCS, for instance. Here you can see the offshore scenario, so the scenario where offshore wind becomes the kind of the pivotal technology. Here you have one which relies more on CCS. Both of these don't really address, or I mean, they push the question of just transition and kind of the socioeconomic dimension to the emergence of those new technologies. Now, if you look at the phase-out scenario, that becomes more difficult because there is no general acceptance for the need to phase out the oil and gas sector. And there, all the difficult issues regarding why just transition can at the same time be the key, but also the barrier if it is understood primarily as, in highly conservative terms, in terms of sticking by different particular modes of doing business and organizing the industry. So this vision of phase out is dotted with problems, traps. We could see that our stakeholders are very uneasy about it. That said, and I will just finish here because I know I'm running out of time. Relying on fossil fuel sector as a pillar of Norwegian economy is unsustainable in the long run, and there is a need for managed decline and nurturing alternatives. Any serious discussion of phase out in the Norwegian context must have a long-term perspective, giving the country a chance to prepare for the transition and understanding that whichever pathway is selected, it will create challenges. So there is no easy way out of this. And currently we see two coalitions that have already emerged. One definitely pro-climate, the other certainly pro-industry. They both try to initiate dialogue with each other, but in reality, they're only launching two monologues talking past each other. So an important element to really start with the political just transition projects that are needed is to break this wall that divides the two sides. And we've been trying to do this for our project. We hope that we actually manage to start, but it's still a long way ahead. Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much, Kacper. What I propose we do, we move on to the next presenter. So we go through the 4 interventions. And then one question that I will have towards the end to all of you is, how do you see the developments in the next? So I know that one thing you told us about the realities on the ground, but what is your sort of expert prediction in terms of what will happen with that debate in the next couple of years? I know there are so many uncertainties, but that's kind of the challenges I think researchers like. So thank you so much, Kacper. We move now to Paul Madsen. Paul will actually be present through a recording. Unfortunately, they couldn't be with us. I just want to say that the case of Denmark is very interesting because some of you may think Denmark is a done deal, is an established leader, and our research team basically challenged the phase-out date, which is also very interesting to just show how sort of impactful analytics is needed. Like everybody needs it, no matter how ambitious you appear on the global scene. So I think I'm being told that I just need to press the button, and then we have the recording, the video, and the slides. Let's see if this is working.
In this presentation, I shall present the Danish phase-out of oil and gas and some lessons for other countries. The Danish phase-out became a reality only about 3 years ago, and it had 11 elements. The most important of these elements is point number 1 on this slide, namely that it was widely accepted politically to phase off all extraction of oil and gas by 2050 in Denmark. But there were also other important elements as part of this agreement. First of all, there was a element of just transition, but more importantly, I think, was that the whole idea of making this agreement was to show global leadership and hopefully make other countries follow along, phasing out oil and gas as soon as possible by showing that this is actually possible. We did a lot of research in finding out why this became possible, and the tipping point, the initial what made it all happen was actually that it was widely acknowledged that there was not much oil and gas left, and hence not much state revenue left in the Danish North Sea, as you can see from the next slide. What you see here is a steeply declining state revenue, deriving partly from taxation of oil and gas, partly from the 20% ownership of oil and gas by the Danish state. And you see that already before 2045, there's a very limited amount of state revenues. And this very limited amount of state revenue made us think, why not make this phase out earlier? And we posed ourselves this research question: what would the loss in state revenues be if we accelerated the phase out to, let's say, 2042 or even 2034? And pricing, you can see that in 2042 the loss was very, very limited, and only if we were even more ambitious and tried to phase out already as early as 2034, there would be a significant reduction in revenues, but still it was not very much if we compare it to GDP. So therefore we suggested to make an earlier phase out. This, of course, this has not happened though, and it raises the question why. But let's first see what are the prospects in an earlier phase out, and we think we can point to 4 aspects. First of all, we already had witnessed there's some advantages in being a first mover, and now we could be an even earlier mover, and that would lead to some advantages. First of all, it would accelerate the green adjustment of the Danish economy, and it will also make our case more convincing. We could have a stronger impact on other countries as a role model concerning a phase out of oil and gas. And we also have to realize that making these kind of supply side restraints are necessary from an ecological perspective anyhow. Just because there's oil and gas in the ground, it might be advisable to leave it in the ground. But we also have to realize there are some barriers to an earlier phase out. First of all, in the Danish society, there's a strong consensus that 2050 is the agreed upon deadline, and that is as ambitious as it gets. Furthermore, and that might be even more importantly, there's a widespread but not documented belief that if we try to pursue an earlier phase out than 2050, this will be very, very expensive, because we might then expect some compensation claims by private operators in the North Sea, because they have actually planned to extract oil and gas until 2050. But this has not been documented in any sense. Finally, I would like to say a couple of words. What could the Danish case then be of how could it learn the thing? And I think we are trying to analyze this quite a bit, and we see four key lessons. First of all, it's important to establish a consensus, especially between the energy industry and the labor unions relevant to this industry, to find out how do we cope with this transition. Then it is crucial to fix a date. That should be a specific date. It should not be sometimes in the future. There should be a fixed date, because that makes it creates a more stable investment environment, and it also gives time enough to adjust both for the labor force but also to the firms. Then it will be much more important than in the Danish context to compensate losers, and also and that's very important, to initiate some new alternative green developments to substitute the activities that was related to oil and gas. And finally, it's very important to, as part of the justice transition process, to educate and re-educate the workforce, and it should be not just any kind of re-education. It should be targeted to a world of renewables. And finally, we actually have to destroy education and research related to oil and gas and replace it with education and research into renewables. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I must say that was pretty, I shouldn't have told you this was a recording, right? Except you won't be able to ask Paul any questions. So thank you very much for that. And I think without further ado, let us move to the next presentation by Navraj Singh Gali, who is the senior lecturer in climate law from University of Edinburgh. And of course, Navraj, I'm sure you have to say something about the recent sort of headlines from the UK about the Prime Minister pulling out of lots of ambitious commitments. Anyway, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Andre, and thank you very much, those of you present. I assume that you can see my slides. I think you can. So this is a presentation by myself. I'm a lawyer, and other key members of our team were Catherine Jenkins, who's a sociologist of technology, and Stuart Hazeldine, who's a geoscientist. So this is a genuinely interdisciplinary piece of work.
Navraj, sorry, could you speak up a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Good. The first sentence was good, but now it went very...
Okay, I'll try and speak a little bit louder.
Yeah, better.
Okay. So central question for us thinking about this presentation is, what have we learnt in the 3 years of this project? And the world has changed quite a lot. But let me just run through some of what we've done. So in the first part of the research, we produced this report. This is our phase 1 report, essentially, at which point it was very clear that oil and gas in the UK was in decline. It was being displaced very successfully with renewable energy. Principally, the big difference maker was offshore wind, which has really transformed the UK power sector. And if you take a longer view, this is but the most recent of technology transitions since industrialization. But one of the features of industrialization in industrial transitions in the United Kingdom is that they always come at a very significant social cost. So they're quite different from transitions in other jurisdictions, and indeed in other case studies in this broader project. One of the central reasons for this is governance. The mode of governance in the United Kingdom is notoriously centralised. The locus of the transition, whether it be northeast of Scotland or eastern England, is not contiguous with the loci of power. We see that institutions such as the Scottish Just Transition Commission is not matched either at UK level or in other constituent parts of the United Kingdom with such depth. And such UK-wide transitional policies as do exist have been poorly coordinated and have been rather questionable have been assessed to be rather questionable. The Levelling Up Fund being a case in point. When we came around to the second phase of the work, we developed a set of principles or requirements for a just transition for the oil and gas sector in the United Kingdom, better intergovernmental relations, the Canadian model, for example, of provincial and federal meetings being a very good model, requirement for quantification of the implications of future oil and gas exploration. This came off the back of a piece of litigation which was initiated by Uplift, amongst others. I'll just focus here on something on point 5, which is CCS. We note, of course, that in each of the other two presentations, CCS figured prominently, at least in terms of scenarios which were preferred by industry and governments. And in addition to that, the idea of a carbon take-back obligation came up quite strongly in our stakeholder conversations, both conversations with academic stakeholders and also industry stakeholders. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But I think the other half dozen or so points will read across quite naturally to most just transitions discourses and indeed the other case studies. So standardization of labour force qualifications, better participatory processes, training funds, and so on. Okay, so that's where we were after about a year and a half. And what did we learn from that? Well, a couple of things. The first was that there was some very significant framing impacts. Firstly, from the IEA roadmap and then the AR6 of the IPCC around the non-permissibility of investment in new oil and gas exploration. So this had a very powerful impact on the conversations that we were having, either positively or negatively. Not everybody took them at their words, but it was nevertheless a coalescing point that all conversations had to engage with. And then, of course, there was the war in Ukraine, which has already been mentioned. But it's worth noting that prior to the war in Ukraine, there was something that was very, very close to a consensus within the UK around no new licensing in the North Sea. It was really close, but it was upended very decisively by Russian aggression in Ukraine, and we've not been close to it since. That is notwithstanding the fact that ongoing decarbonisation commitments are in place, and as they have been since 2008, really. And since 2008, there's been a very strong left-right, Labour Conservative and beyond consensus on them. What we've seen since Monday is, as Andre alluded to this, is what is quite remarkable rowing back from those. And that goes to the third point on this slide, which is that obviously this is a very contentious policy space, and something that we saw in our stakeholder engagement was that this is a real Kulturkampf of the sort that was not anticipated when we started this research. The net zero problematic or solution has become part of cultural wars in the United Kingdom and I'm sure elsewhere. It makes doing research quite difficult because some stakeholders will not engage in a forum which has other stakeholders in them. It's a highly polarized space.
Navrach, sorry, you're almost at time. Or
am I done? Okay, I will just conclude on this then. So one of the things that one of the next generation solutions which was posited then was this idea of the carbon take-back obligation. And it was pushed off from this premise that we need to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming. We can all agree that, but we need to do it before the world stops using fossil fuels. So this is a sort of realist approach to the idea that fossil fuels will continue to be used. How do we need to deal with that? So, and the idea is that it's a mandate to require fossil fuel and cement producers, the lime producers, to capture and permanently store a fraction of their scope 3 CO2 production over time. So that's the basic idea. Whether it addresses those 4 bullets, which it would have to do, is an open question. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then I think let's move to Felipe. Felipe has the challenging but also very important job, right? And I'd really encourage you to read the final report. Felipe is one of the main authors, which really extracts lots of useful and interesting lessons from the over 2 years of our work. So Felipe, over to you, and then one round of little questions.
Thanks, Andre. And I should probably just start by saying, giving you a little bit of additional context, which might be helpful. When SEI, the co-lead of this project, looked into where we would focus, the case studies that we would focus on, we picked the North Sea because we saw these countries that shared some interesting characteristics. Liberal democracies with long-standing governance institutions, wealthy, high-income countries, countries with social safety nets that could help their societies in the event of downturns. You group these together as countries that have the capacity to transition. And so, yeah, that's just a little bit of interesting context. But to come on to the question that you asked, Andre, around the lessons, I think there's quite a few when you look across the 3 case studies. So the first one is that really government has the primary responsibility for the transition. And that might feel like a bit of a no-brainer, like, yeah, of course it's government. It has the policy levers to be able to help, the regulatory levers. But when you think about what that actually means, we're calling for a bit of a shift in state intervention. During downturns, governments are usually, we see time and again, governments step in to try to prop up the oil and gas industry. And what we need in this sense is for governments to break with that pattern that keeps locking in carbon emissions for decades to come. And this will require some level of popular support to spur that political willingness to shift that level of intervention. The second point, which I thought was quite interesting and something that we didn't really discuss in the presentation today, was that in each of these scenarios, we talked a little bit about net zero, reaching net zero, or versus phase out. And phase out obviously being a bit more of a drastic approach to reaching, to phasing out oil and gas emissions. And there was a bit of a tension. So in the net zero scenarios, there was a bit of an understanding that net zero is the social license for oil and gas companies to operate. So it makes sense that they say these things on net zero, and we see it from governments as well in the case of the UK, saying, we're going to continue maxing out our oil and gas reserves, but it's fine because we're going to reach net zero regardless. And there's a tension between these things. It's a highly contested space. And the solution here is not to depoliticize, right? We heard Casper's mentioning the breaking down that wall. If you politicize this issue and you turn it into a sort of technocratic analysis, you're not breaking down that wall. This is something that needs to happen. So you need those kind of transition processes that are very transparent and that are inclusive, democratic. But also you need that kind of narrative, the overarching narrative to link the long-term vision of what you're trying to achieve with some of the short-term measures that you need to put in place to be able to achieve that. And I come back to the context that I gave at the very beginning, because one of the things we actually learned, and you mentioned it, Andre, at the beginning, was that even when you look at a production region and the countries within a production region, you can't take for granted that just because on the outside they seem the same, you'll be able to say, okay, the solutions are going to be the same, or, etc. And one of the things we definitely learned was that the national context, the history, the socioeconomic conditions really do matter. And at the same time, if you kind of scale up, when you look at it internationally, the international context matters. So when we look at these countries, we're not looking at a Petri dish, right? They're not operating in a vacuum. There's stuff underneath and stuff above that kind of, has an impact. And maybe I can say as well that aside from the lessons that we learned within these case studies, we also thought, okay, how can we extrapolate this to other countries outside of the North Sea, particularly in the emerging markets and developing countries? And we saw a few things. So, for instance, we saw, or we can hypothesize that it really matters where you are in the production curve as a country. It makes sense that if you're a country either as an emerging producer or one with dwindling resources, that's one condition that we have to think about when we think where are the countries that could potentially transition away. It makes sense to focus on those two ends of the sort of production curve, if you will. There's also the alternatives that are available for the workforce in particular countries that has an impact. The kind of culture or identity that a country has with oil and gas, a country or region has with oil and gas. And also, as I mentioned earlier, the governance, tradition, and institutions that are in place. And you think, okay, if you think of those four things, they seem a little bit like a wish list. But really, if you think about it, it really means that when you look at a country or a region and you look at those four criteria that I mentioned, and it's also in our report, you can kind of say, okay, well, if there's a weak governance traditions in this country, but the other criteria are met, maybe this is where we focus our attention as the international community or as civil society organizations to help reach, to help fulfill that criteria in a way. Yeah, or in the other cases as well. And maybe I can just wrap up. I can just wrap up by saying that we find ourselves in the US, so maybe there's a bit of a US message to say here. And when I remember when Dan Jørgensen, the climate minister for Denmark, was in town at Columbia University, he was asked at the very end, after giving a very sort of, yeah, we can do it. What is your advice for the US? And his advice was, you have to focus on climate leadership. The US has to be a climate leader, and it kind of gave you can be the next Denmark in this sense. And I kind of saw that and I thought, okay, it's difficult to say that at a time of geopolitical strife and a crisis in multilateralism. So my advice would actually be, or to add to that advice, I would probably say, we know the lessons from unmanaged transitions. They don't go well for, not just for balanced books, but also for the people and the communities that depend on some of these industries. And I think about in the US, the Appalachia region, you have a history of this, coal transitions being bad and, leaving communities behind. And so my message here is there needs to be some focus on that part of things. Like you can already, you don't have to have the US saying we're going to phase out today, but you can already begin to plan for a transition that is absolutely inevitable, because the consequences of not doing so are detrimental for communities and society as a whole.
Great, Felipe. Thank you so much. I'm still intending to end at 11, so please don't worry, but we have, through Selvin's cancellation, we have a bit of room. I still want to challenge our colleagues back in Europe. How would you see the development in the next couple of years, considering what you have learned in the project and considering the sort of the alarming developments? Kacper and Navrach, I'm just curious about your sort of vision for the short-term future.
Navrach, do you want to go first?
Go ahead, Kacper.
Go first, Kacper.
Thanks. Well, this is of course a difficult question. I recently had a meeting with the major Norwegian state oil company Equinor, and you can see that they are certainly, there is a growing understanding that the world is changing, that decarbonization is a process to acknowledge and to take into account in all your business plans, and that net zero is probably a goal that is going to be stable in terms of consecutive governments who are going to devise strategies of reaching net zero at some point, hopefully sooner rather than later. However, at the same time, I can still feel that the Norwegian industry still does not believe in a world without oil and gas. So they still cannot imagine that this world is really a plausible future. And for this to really happen, I think there are luckily there are three processes which are external to the Norwegian oil and gas sector, which might actually bring us there in terms of political consensus that, as Felipe said, is going to first limit the governmental support for the sector, which will change the calculation of the entire business of fossil fuel extraction, and then with time probably lead to a gradual phase down, maybe at the end, phasing out of the sector. And those three elements are first societal change, so a change in a gradual increase in acknowledging climate change as a planetary crisis. Believe it or not, I mean, Norway has a reputation for being quite green, but it's also still surprisingly strong on climate denialism, which is fairly open in the media. But it has been changing, and there is probably a growing political consensus now about the need to act more firmly and to devise policies that are going to really tackle the problem. Of course, invested in money and invested interests are blocking this to a large extent. The second element is technological change. So alternatives are becoming more affordable and more realistic. The Northern Lights project, which is Norway's pilot CCS project, is going to become commercial soon. Probably next year, it's going to take its first transport of carbon dioxide from Denmark, actually. Of course, the scale of this right now, it's still negligible, but it is, I mean, there is hope. Hydrogen is another technology which the Norwegian sector is looking into. And then last but not least, European Union pressure. For our American audience, it might be surprising because Norway is not a member of the EU, but it is subject to most of EU regulation, especially in the area of green transition, climate and energy. And so the EU's firm stance and kind of direction in terms of achieving net zero and aligning all policies, coordinating policies towards the goals of the Paris Agreement, this is influencing Norway as well. And it's also sending very clear signals to Norwegian investors and Norwegian oil and gas sector companies that, yes, you have to really seriously think of alternatives and perhaps not yet divest, but at least consider not investing further in a sector that might be unprofitable in a very near future. So that's my take on it.
Thank you, Kacper. Navrach.
Okay, thank you. So one thing that I found very interesting in the discussion we've just had is that finding from Denmark, that they essentially took up a project of no new oil because they had no oil. This was not a project of some altruism. There was no revenues there. So they said, okay, it's rather like saying, I'm not going to have another drink because I've got no money in my pocket. Okay, it's a very bold stance on sobriety. And even when the fiscal impacts of an earlier date were more or less trivial. I think the figure was 0.1% of GDP if the stop date was pulled back 14 years. Even that was too much. Okay, so let's bear in mind what's happening here. There is even in the most virtuous of liberal democracies, there is a desperate reluctance to let go of oil and gas money. And I don't think that's solely about governments. In fact, I think it's not really about governments. I think it's largely about industry. I think the industry is driving this process. So if we go back to that idea that we need to stop using fossil fuels we need to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming, but we need to do it before the world stops using fossil fuels, I think that's absolutely right. And this, incidentally, I should have attributed it. This is a phrase which Miles Allen, who's a physicist at Oxford, is using, and Miles and Stuart Hazelden are really the two originators of the carbon take-back obligation idea. So, I mean, if there's money on the table, I don't think anybody's going to leave it there. And I think that's a hard truth that that climate policy and climate campaigning, I think, needs to get round to. Now, how you address that is a different matter. Okay, and I think it can be addressed. It was interesting that what Casper just said about technology. It's so fascinating how in the last few years, really since the US CHIPS Act and the IRA, that we're back to the early 2000s and George Bush and saying, well, we can resolve climate change through technology. That's essentially the current approach. We're not doing it through carbon pricing. Okay, we've done with that. There was a foolish mistake that we thought we could do that. We lost 15, maybe 20 years of time to do that. Technologies are the way we're going to do this, and amongst other things, CCS perhaps is one of them, right? Okay, fine. Of course, it's obviously the case that technology in and of itself is not going to solve these problems. Technology is mediated by social, legal power structures. And if it's not organized via those mechanisms in the correct way, the new world will be just as oppressive and ecologically catastrophic as the old world was. So technology in and of itself isn't going to solve this problem. The third point, it really goes to the starting point for this whole project. This project was a project on just transitions, and we were looking at oil and gas because to try and move just transitions away from its home, and its home was coal. It started out in coal transitions. Andre was key in that policy debate around just transitions in Polish and other Eastern European coal regions. And what we were trying to do is to see if we could, if just transition has traction beyond that very specific locus. And I think it's still an open question. I think it's an open question territorially, and I think it's an open question in terms of oil and gas versus coal. I think the other thing to realize, and I know that there's a climate strategies project on this, is the extent to which just transitions can be effectively deployed outside of liberal democracies, which is, after all, where most emissions in the world emanate from. So, which is not to impugn just transitions as such. Where it works, it works. Where it works, and where it does work, we should continue to deploy it and seek to augment it. But it's also worthwhile thinking about its the optimal conditions and the necessary conditions for its efficacious use.
Well, thank you very much, Navrach, and also thank you very much for making what I would call a bit of a marketing pitch, because this is actually where we want to go forward. As Felipe also alluded a little bit, we want to kind of test some of those approaches in the developing middle income economies, which I think is desperately needed. It will be fascinating. I think if you guys allow, I would like to stop here with our panel. First of all, there is no coffee break, right? So please, each time you want to stretch your legs, just stand up, get yourself a coffee, go to the back row if you need, but we are not going to have a formal coffee break. It's an interest of time. So thank you so much. I hope you can stay with us, Kacper and Navrach. Oh, Navrach already disappeared, okay. Thank you for joining remotely. And Felipe, I'm sure you'll be able to still intervene, but I just didn't want to keep the speakers sort of in waiting. So without further ado, Kelly Trout, research co-director of Oil Change International, and she's going to talk about US oil and gas expansion. And I really wanted to kind of explore whether the transatlantic collaboration, whether there is something here. I don't think a lot is happening. If anything, it's probably more like hostility, but I don't know. I'm also curious about your take on that. So Kelly, if you can come here, I don't know, I'd read the slides. I should do it, or you'll do it? Oh yeah, maybe you can have that, yeah. Would you like to be here, or? Yeah, so let me just, my junk.
All right. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you all who are here in person, as well as those of you online. And my presentation is going to focus on kind of three elements. So first, I'll just give a sort of that basic overview of where are we at with oil and gas production right now in the United States. What is the outlook for expansion of oil and gas production in the United States and the implications of that, both for global just transitions and for frontline communities in the US? And then I'll look at the need for a rapid reversal of the trajectory that we're currently on in the US and some policies to help enable that. Is the mic good? Okay, great. And bear with me because I realize this is my first in-person presentation since before the pandemic. So, all right. So first for the current context, as you can see by the figures on the screen now, the recent history of oil and gas extraction in the US has been one of dramatic expansion. Unfortunately, we've seen a near doubling of total oil and gas production between 2010 to last year, as you can see on the left there. And to the extent that right now the US is the world's leading oil and gas producer, we produce 1 out of every 5 barrels of oil and gas that were extracted globally last year. And this rapid expansion, as many of you may be aware, has been driven by the proliferation of fracking. And that has also dramatically changed the landscape of extraction in the US, which is kind of documented on the graph on the right there, and also concentrated the pollution impacts of oil and gas on certain communities, and particularly in the Gulf South, Gulf Coast region along New Mexico, Texas, and Louisiana. For a sense of scale, compared to sort of the challenge of transitions in some other countries, in 2022, just the state of Pennsylvania produced more gas than the entire country of Norway. And the 2 states of Texas and New Mexico, if you were to take them out of US production, alone produced more oil and gas than the entire country of Saudi Arabia. So that gives you a sense of the scale of extraction in the US, and a reason that a lot of that is concentrated right now in Texas and New Mexico is that the Permian Basin that spans those states is really the epicenter of fracking and oil and gas expansion in the world at present. And that expansion is also driving or feeding what is the biggest concentration of refining and petrochemical infrastructure in the world along the US Gulf Coast. Unfortunately, as you can also see here, the current projection is that this is going to continue increasing over the next 5 to 10 years under current US policies. And I think it's important to point out that recent studies and a whole history of research has looked at the fact that this is not only a climate crisis issue, but also a crisis of environmental justice and what some have termed fossil fuel racism in the United States. So what we're increasingly seeing is pollution hotspots and health sacrifice zones that are disproportionately impacting Black, Brown, Indigenous, and low-income communities where this proliferation of oil and gas infrastructure is taking off. Another thing I want to point out here for context is that this dramatic expansion of production has not necessarily dramatically increased the weight of oil and gas extraction within the US economy as a whole. Of course, there are regional differences, and oil and gas is huge in Texas, but if you look at the economy as a whole, there are actually less jobs directly in oil and gas extraction and support activities for extraction last year than there were in 2010, despite this near doubling of production over the same time period. And revenues from fossil fuel extraction or oil and gas extraction on federal lands and waters represent less than 1% of the total income of the US federal government. So that's a difference compared to a country like Norway. Now, at this point, you might be asking, what about that big US climate bill, the Inflation Reduction Act? Will that help rein in this expansion of extraction? And unfortunately, what we are seeing right now is no. Modeling by the Rhodium Group in the US that accounts for the policy impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act points to what could be an increasing decoupling of US oil and gas consumption and use. So consumption, thanks to some of those current climate policies in the US, is likely to start decreasing towards 2030, 2035, at the same time, we could see production continue to increase with the massive escape hatch of oil and gas exports. So the US is also one of the world's leading oil and gas exporters, and we could see that trend increase. And it's important to point out that here, communities outside of extraction zones might start to see some transition, but communities in those extraction hotspots are just going to see growing health and other pollution impacts from oil and gas in that case. And now to the reason that we also saw 75,000 people marching through the streets of New York City here over the weekend, with the very clear message for President Biden to end fossil fuels. So while we have seen the Biden administration take certain steps forward and increase investments in renewable energy and reducing energy consumption in some areas, adding renewables on top of fossil fuels in the US will not make a transition, and certainly not a just transition either. So on the whole, we've seen policies from the Biden administration continue to facilitate a lot of the oil and gas expansion that's happening. So just in the past 12 months, we've seen the approval of massive pieces of LNG and other export infrastructure along the US Gulf Coast and in Alaska. And what you may not recognize about the Inflation Reduction Act is that it could end up amounting to one of the largest giveaways to the oil and gas industry in US history. And that's because of uncapped tax credits that are included in that legislation to support gas-based hydrogen production, as well as carbon capture and storage. And currently in the US, most carbon capture and storage is actually being used to pump more oil out of the ground. Excuse me. And a lot of frontline communities will argue that, if you're addressing fossil fuel emissions through CCS, you're not addressing all of the other toxic air and water pollution that's resulting from that fossil fuel production and use. And so as a result of current policies, what we found in a report that we at Oil Change International released last week called Planet Wreckers is that the US is also now poised to be the world's largest oil and gas expander, potentially responsible for over 1/3 of new carbon pollution from the drilling of new oil and gas fields and fracking wells globally from now to 2050. It's important to point out here that it's not just, or that in total, the 5 wealthiest global North producers on this list account for a majority of the oil and gas expansion threat to 2050. So that includes some of the other countries we're talking about here, Norway and the UK. And the reason we see this as highly problematic for a global just transition is that these are some of the countries with the greatest economic means and historical responsibility to actually be leading globally in a rapid phase out of production. So rapid transitions are going to be hard everywhere, but I think we can agree that countries with high wealth and relatively low fiscal dependence on fossil fuel revenues are best able to manage a just transition that actually minimizes those social and economic impacts. More specifically, we saw a study last year by researchers at the Tyndall Center in the UK look at what how to sequence globally a phase out of oil and gas production that would account for countries' varying economic means and capacity. And it put the US, as well as the UK and Norway and Denmark, in a category of countries that really should be aiming to phase out their oil and gas production by 2035, if other countries with less capacity and more dependence on the industry are to have a little more lead time to manage the impacts of the transition. What you can see in this graph is I've compared that trajectory towards a potential phase out of US oil and gas production by 2035 in that yellow line to the decline in production we could see if the US would to take that first step and actually stop oil and gas expansion. So you can see it is a relatively dramatic picture. So if we were to stop drilling new fracking wells, stop new fields, stop new licensing in the United States, because of the high decline rates of fracking, we might see as much as a 50% fall in US oil and gas production by 2030. At the same time, that's still not as fast of a phase out in US production as is indicated by this sort of equitable global pathway that's been modeled based on the US's high capacity, high responsibility as the world's largest climate polluter, and the largest oil and gas producer. And I'll close my remarks out on this slide just with a few thoughts on essential elements of what a holistic US oil and gas phase out policy could look like. And I want to note that these are inspired by a lot of the platforms that have come out of frontline community organizing and climate justice organizations in the US. So first is to stop the cycle of harm. And that's something that marchers were asking President Biden to do last weekend. So to stop issuing new federal permits for fossil fuel infrastructure, to initiate a phase down of oil and gas production on federal lands, to declare a climate emergency, which could unlock new federal powers to curb oil and gas exports and to mobilize resources to frontline and vulnerable communities. And I think it's also essential that US climate policy really prioritize the needs of frontline communities. It's not just about carbon, but about the health impacts of fossil fuels in the US. And that's something that's really critical to reflect in policy. And I think the third key here is to build the new without repeating the harmful extractive patterns of the fossil fuel industry. So it's not just about changing how we power our homes, but about who holds the power over US climate policy. And there's a lot of exciting work being done also about creating models of public and community control over energy systems, strengthening unions, and finding ways to implement climate policies that would build a much more robust social safety net in the US.
I was about to say that this is a good setup, that speakers stay here, I move here. So thank you so much, Kelly. So now I think we have the time for a couple of questions, if there are any. So please raise your hand and then, just introduce yourself. And if you could be very brief, same request to Kelly. We have just like maybe 5 minutes for that.
Hi, Kelly, and my name is Mark Davis from Cafeteria. It's a question for you, but also I think for some of perhaps the UK representative from the last call, which is, what's the best counter argument to the following argument, which is, I'm in the UK or maybe in the US, my gas or oil is better than your gas or oil, it's better than imports, therefore we need to produce more, and this is a positive climate commitment. This is the argument that so many countries and companies are using, and notably the chair of COP28. So what's the best counter argument to that argument?
Well, I would say that we have all the solutions that we need to rapidly phase out this oil and gas production. The problem is we're not actually investing in them. And the more that we invest in new oil and gas, the harder it's actually going to be to implement and phase in those solutions. I think you can also see from some of this presentation that, it's not just about that we can build alternatives in a way that also makes our society as a whole healthier and less polluted and more resilient to different climate disasters. So I think there's also a great responsibility of the US to recognize that we do have the capacity to actually invest in these alternatives at a much more rapid pace than a lot of other countries. So yeah, put it there.
Thank you so much, Richard. I saw you, and then the lady in front. Just take both together.
Thanks. Working. Thanks, Andre. Yeah. Richard Follen from Carbon Tracker. I actually had a couple of questions more about the UK and Denmark. I don't know, is Navraj still on? Yes, he is. Yeah. Hi, Navraj. And then I don't know if anybody can fill in on Denmark, given that that he was recording. So, but Navraj, on developments over the next couple of years, which Andre asked you about, you didn't mention the Labour Party opposition. And if the polls are right, and we're 12, 13 months out, then they will be in government then. And they have said that they have plans to issue no new oil and gas licenses when they come in. But my sense is, but welcome your views on this, that they've still got quite a bit more to do in terms of landing engagement around the just transition, getting the trades unions on board, for example. So interest any comments that you have on that. And then Andre, I don't know if anybody's able to answer about Denmark, but there was a line up there in the presentation that's saying some sort of belief, concern about that the oil and gas industry will sue for compensation. So I mean, would that be under the Energy Charter Treaty? I don't know if Denmark's got plans to leave under the Energy Charter Treaty like a number of European governments have, or is that more just based on belief as opposed to hard evidence? Because governments move deadlines on all sorts of things back and forward the whole time. So question there as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take the question in front and then maybe here as well after.
Yeah. So thank you very much. It's been really interesting. My name's Madeline Thompson. I'm from the Wellcome Trust in the UK, which is a health foundation. One of the things we're interested in is the role of health arguments in trying to drive narratives around decarbonisation. I was particularly interested in the fact that methane has not been discussed at all and whether or not that is even considered to be an issue, because it's very much or has been put as a central issue at the forthcoming COP. So do you think that's a distraction, or do you think that actually as part of this having to ensure that we don't have the impacts of the fossil fuels while they're still continuing, methane is a useful thing to go? I'm just curious.
Thank you. And maybe we take the last question now, and then, yeah, we go to rapid responses.
Hi, my name is Nicola Woodruff. I'm from the Natural Resource Governance Institute. This question is for Kelly, and it's about U.S. production on federal versus non-federal lands. I'm just not clear on like whether the majority of the production is on federal lands, and so phase out. You referred to phasing out on federal lands. What about non-federal lands, and what would be the sort of legal levers to implement phase out on non-federal land?
Thank you so much. So if I can now ask everybody to just stay within a minute of response. So Kelly, Navraj, and Kacper, if you want to add something. Thank you. No, go, Kelly, go first.
Okay, sure. I can kick it off. So to the methane question, our sort of approach to that is that we need to be cleaning up the methane pollution as we're phasing out oil and gas. So it's not an either or. I think the problem we're seeing is that the industry treats cleaning up methane pollution from oil and gas production as the answer to continue expanding oil and gas. But it is essential to address that as a health and climate problem, but also to phase out gas production at the same time. In terms of your question about federal lands, so the majority of this extraction is happening on private lands, and that's pretty unique in the US case. But that's part of the levers we see there are for the Biden administration, as well as other regulators, to actually stop approving some of the infrastructure related or necessary to continue expanding extraction on private lands that still needs federal approval. So that's infrastructure like the Mountain Valley Pipeline or the Seaport Oil Terminal in Texas, or Alaska LNG. So there's a lot of enabling infrastructure for extraction that the federal government has levers over.
Thank you. Navraj, over to you. Definitely to respond to the UK question.
Okay, thank you. So on the question of licensing in a future Labour government, well, in between that time, assuming there is a change of government, in between then and now, there will likely be a rash of licensing, which once issued is practically impossible to reverse. So that's I think the primary problem. I think it's probably quite likely that that a Labour government wouldn't issue new licenses, except under a very strict CCS regime, although my understanding is that they're not particularly interested in that idea, and either indifferent / hostile to the carbon take-back obligation idea. So I think that's an interesting space. There's a question about the trade union movement. The trade union movement here has always had a very interesting and important role. Traditionally, it's been dismissive of the environmental movement. There's been some form of rapprochement, but nonetheless, it is the case that when there's a choice between massive high carbon infrastructures, Heathrow Airport, new oil and gas, the trade union movement tends, not exclusively, but it tends towards a high carbon, what they would call a high good quality workforce solution than a net zero one. But that's more finely balanced than it used to be. There's also a question about shale in the UK. For the time being, and I must say for the foreseeable future, that seems to be a dead, I'm glad to say, although who knows with this government.
Thank you so much. Kacper, would you like to respond to any of the points?
I mean, there was just a question of methane. It is, of course, somewhat debated in Norway. At the same time, the Norwegian sector is proudly boasting that the Norwegian oil and gas is the greenest in the world in terms of different production-related emissions. Whether that is really true is debated, but I mean, this is not really a major issue, I would say.
Okay, I'm afraid we have to stop here, and Richard, we will pass or maybe link you up to our Danish colleagues, because I think this is, I'm glad you picked that up, because I think it's important to know what is the foundation for that statement. So thank you very much, Kelly. Thank you very much for asking questions. I just want to say I am aware that there were some questions in the chat box, so we try to allow for that in the later sort of the next opportunity we have. But without further ado, let me move to Ploy Achakulwusut from Stockholm Environment Institute, and she will talk about global oil and gas production pathways in line with net zero. I think if you would like to tell us more about this and see how what else you add to our conversation here. Ploy.
Thank you, Andre, and thank you to you all for being here in person and to those tuning in online as well. So yeah, today I wanted to share some sort of more of the scientific evidence from the latest IPCC report on the global oil and gas reduction pathways that would be aligned with a net zero future. Next slide, please. Oh, okay, I can do it myself. Okay, great. So for those of you who don't know me, since joining SEI in 2019, I've been helping to lead the Production Gap Report series, which takes inspiration from the long-standing UNEP Emissions Gap Report series. Essentially, what we're trying to do with the PGR is to track the levels of global coal, oil, and gas production being planned by governments worldwide, and to compare that against global levels consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. And I want to push back a bit on what Navraj said earlier about industry playing a main role. I think it's both, it's industry and governments. I mean, around half of global oil and gas production is controlled by state-owned enterprises. Government plans and policies play a major role in legitimizing, influencing targets. And what we do in the Production Gap Report is to actually just slog through and compile the national energy strategies from publicly available government documents. They don't report this under any, the UNFCCC, Paris Agreement, NDCs. But when we actually look at what they're planning in the national energy strategies, one of the key findings from the Production Gap Report, which I think a lot of you are familiar with, is that as of 2021, governments were still planning to produce more than double the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 than would be consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And as much as I would love to share our findings from our 2023 report, it's being finalized right now. It's under strict embargo, but I just wanted to give a teaser that it's slated for release on the 8th of November. So please mark your calendars. It will be published by SEI and our partners, Climate Analytics, ISD, E3G, and UNEP this year. And so what this year's production gap analysis will reflect is both updates to our so-called government plans and projections pathway shown in the red line here. So reflecting how governments might have changed their fossil fuel production targets in light of the recent global energy crisis, increasing climate commitments and ambitions, as well as global demand in coal, oil, and gas peaking within this century, according to the IEA. But this year we'll also be updating for the first time since the launch of the PGR, the new low carbon pathways consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. And so that's what I want to spend most of today talking about. So this work was just published last week in Nature Communications. I'm really excited to share it because I've basically just been spending 1.5 years trying to dig into why some of these scenarios show such high gas, what it means for deriving policy insights from these, highly influential, authoritative mitigation scenarios compiled by the IPCC 6 assessments report. So one of the kind of first key takeaways, so these figures show the pathways of global coal, oil, and gas production by 94 so-called C1 scenarios that limit warming to 1.5 degrees C with no or limited overshoot. So you can see here all the individual, it's sort of like a spaghetti plot of all the individual scenarios. So kind of what stands out is that we do see substantial reductions in coal and oil production amongst these pathways, but there's a huge diversity in the gas production pathways. Some do see rapid declines, almost a near phase out by 2050. Others see quite a continued high gas reliance. And the right-hand side plot shows the cumulative, so 2020 to 2100 total level of coal, oil, and gas production combined. And again, you can see that there's quite this huge diversity in the levels of gas modeled. And so what we kind of wanted to do was to first order understand why there is such this huge diversity, especially for gas. And we found that essentially it's the level of model assumptions on how much future fossil fuel use can be coupled to carbon capture and storage, or CCS. So for example, 6 C1 scenarios modeling the highest levels of cumulative gas supply assume that 53 to 70% of this amount can be coupled to CCS in the future at the point of combustion. And so then, next, kind of really digging into why there is such a variety in the modeled gas pathways. We did a bunch of statistical analyses in the paper and essentially found, as shown in the first plot there, that the gas trajectories can be roughly categorized into 3 typologies. So we see a fast decline pathway shown in the dark blue line there, a slightly more gradual or slower decline pathway, and this quite curious, what we've termed a gas rebound feature, where we actually see a near-term decline followed by a gas revival after around mid-century. What I've also plotted here are a few select other model variables as modeled under the median pathway of these 3 different gas clusters. And for anyone interested, please go read our paper, but I wanted to summarize kind of the key takeaways here without getting too technical. But what we found from our analyses and drawing insights from the literature is that there are 3 factors that highly influence the levels of modeled gas production, which are interdependent and which tend to vary mostly by the model family from where the scenario is generated from and the scenario framework. So what we found is that it's the level of carbon pricing, the model constraints on the availability of CCS or carbon dioxide removal methods, which can include CCS coupled to bioenergy or direct air capture, as well as conventional land-based methods like afforestation, reforestation, and model constraints on renewable energy deployment. So that's sort of, grid integration, assumed costs of renewable energy. And we found that basically the higher gas rebound pathways are typically associated with models that impose no or very limited constraints on the regional CO2 storage capacity, meaning that they then model quite high reliance on CCS to offset the very high gas level, as well as assuming higher costs of renewables. And there were some scenarios in particular that were generated under a particular scenario design that meant that carbon pricing would fall around mid-century after net zero CO2 emissions are reached and mitigation efforts are relaxed. But we think that this could be a sort of modeling artifact, and it kind of, when you think about, real world technological phase in, phase out path dependencies, we think that these high gas pathways are highly questionable and requires a more careful evaluation of the underlying model assumptions and the resulting implications, given its really important policy insights. We're seeing a lot of narratives around gas being a bridge, a transition fuel. And so our paper kind of calls on the modeling community to really dig into the assumptions and what their results mean for global coal, oil, and gas phase out as well. So if we were to take a more precautionary approach to limiting reliance on CDR and fossil CCS, what would happen? So in 2020, a paper led by Neil Grant, who's now at Climate Analytics and is also one of our PGR co-authors this year, ran an expert consensus survey to basically ask CDR experts what they think would be the feasible potential limits on 3 methods of CDR, BECCS, afforestation, and DACS, looking at both technical constraints like CO2 storage capacity, as well as governance constraints, financial considerations, and sustainability considerations. And what we found was that if we were to impose these limits, only 4 C1 scenarios in the AS6 assessed database would meet these criteria. And if we were to derive the median pathway of global coal, oil, and gas production from them, they would imply a much more rapid and extensive reduction in global production of all 3 fuels, but especially for gas, as you can see from these numbers here. So it's almost a doubling of the gas reduction required between 2020 and 2050. So I just kind of want to conclude my talk with some key takeaways for policy implications, maybe respond to some of the questions posed earlier as well. So what these scenarios are basically doing is helping to chart out cost-effective pathways for decarbonizing our energy and land use systems, for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? And so they show that basically we need to be reducing fossil fuel production and use now, alongside other key climate mitigation strategies like expanding renewables, reducing methane emissions from all sources, including oil and gas production, which are all important, but alone they're insufficient. We also need to be phasing out coal, oil, and gas production and use now. And I think in kind of using these, cost optimized model insights, it is important for decision makers to understand their limitations, the underlying assumptions, as well as to consider other lines of evidence. So for example, Kelly led a paper published in ERL showing that the committed emissions from existing fossil fuel producing infrastructure would already exceed the allowable emissions budget for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, implying that basically no new coal mines or oil and gas fields can be built. And so that just compels the case for a rapid phase out, as well as ideas that Kelly and others have mentioned here that, to what extent should we assume that fossil CCS and or novel CDR technologies will manifest at the scales assumed here? But also, really, what does that mean if we also care about sustainable development goals and reducing air pollution, toxic water pollution, protecting frontline communities from fossil fuel extraction sites, and continuing to rely on them while, not addressing fossil fuel production is ignoring all these other near-term non-climatic health harms of continued fossil fuel dependence. And I think more and more, a lot of people working on fossil CCS and CDR, the experts themselves, are saying that, yes, there are vital technologies to address hard to transition sectors like aviation, steelmaking, but they're not an excuse. It's not a free pass to carry on with business as usual. And lastly, this lack of attention from governments. We're seeing everyone very willing to set targets for expanding renewable energy, reduce methane emissions, but very few governments to date in 2023 are still willing to commit to reduce coal, oil, and gas production and use. And this really represents a risk to a coordinated, successful, managed, and just global energy transition needed to ensure a livable present and future. And finally, I just want to mention that in our 2020 production gap report, we kind of talk about some of the equity principles that should be considered when thinking about how to translate these global coal, oil, and gas reduction pathways for different countries. And really, two key metrics are important. A country's transition capacity, so it's their financial, institutional capacity to lead a transition away from fossil fuel production, and their level of socioeconomic dependence on fossil fuel production. And we're seeing a few, emerging leaders in this space, and I think we'll hear more from Sean Bradley shortly on that. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much, Ploy, for this. So here what I'm proposing for the next 5 minutes. So I want to do justice to our online audience. So Adriana, you have a couple of questions. So
most of the questions were for kind of US, European context.
But please
so
still read them. Please still read them out, because I mean this is the challenge, right? We will, and then I'll move to the audience here.
Yeah, of course. And some of them have already been answered also online, just in case. But for instance, we have questions from Alden Mayer from E3G, who is basically asking what is the estimated cost of the transition away from oil and gas in your countries, referring to all the panelists that presented earlier. And what strategies are being proposed to fund those costs? Because he's saying in the US, there is little appetite in our divided Congress for carbon taxes, but some states are considering increasing excise taxes on fossil fuel producers to fund their transitions to a more sustainable development. So he's asking if in Europe we have a similar proposition as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. So let's remember that question now. Of course, Ploy and our audience here in person, if you have a question related to that, to the Ploy's presentation, and more specific, like more generally, I would like also the non-research stakeholders attending to challenge the researchers, right? Basically to say also, is it useful? Have you analyzed all the scenarios and so on? And this is true for Ploy and for everybody else on the team. That's also part of that interaction, how useful it is to present all the information. I mean, I'm sure it's useful, but have we covered everything? Are we capturing everything? So, but anyway, please feel free to ask maybe 1 or 2 questions, and then we just revert to the to our speakers and Ploy. Yeah, also feel free to ask about the US. It's not like you are not allowed to ask questions about the earlier presentations. Any questions from, yeah.
Hi, Patrick Heller from NRGI. I was dreaming that you were going to share with us the results of the 2023 PGR, but of course I totally understand. Thanks so much for the presentation and for this amazing research and this tool. One of the things that I'm kind of curious about as you all prepare for the launch of the next report is kind of how your approach to communicating the findings and the stakes to government stakeholders is evolving. One of the we do, as you know, a lot of work around state-owned oil and gas companies and trying to linking back to something that Navraj mentioned in his remarks, kind of challenge the notion a little bit that putting public money into expansion is always in the national interest, and so therefore to look at, okay, under scenario A, this investment may serve your national interests, even if not the global climate interests, but under scenarios B, C, and D, you're at risk of wasting money and actually not generating the returns that you're hoping for. And it's one of the challenging pieces that we deal with all the time, and I know you all have been wrestling with in the last version of the PGR, is how to convert climate scenarios and demand scenarios into kind of policy actionable decision making. And I'm not asking for the magical answer. It's something we're wrestling with quite a lot as well. But I'm sure as you've been planning for this next round, you all have been thinking about that a lot. So any insights you could share would be really valuable.
So thank you so much. I think we stop here with questions. So Ploy, if you could respond to this one, and then Navrach, Kacper, if Kacper is still online, to Alden's question on transition costs.
Okay. Hi, Patrick. So nice to finally meet you in person. Yeah, great question. I mean, so, the PGR has 20 country profiles of major fossil fuel producing countries as well, where we summarize not only the plans and projections for fossil fuel production targets, but also their existing policies in support of continued production, government subsidies, other indirect forms of support, as well as whether there's movement, the policy discourses towards a managed and just transition. And actually part of the PGR development process involves sending out these country profiles to government reviews through the UNFCCC focal points. So we know that they have, not all of them have responded, some of them have responded. So we know that they're having to reckon and grapple with some of these issues. And we're hearing through some of our UNEP colleagues, that member states do have to think about this. And I think the norms and the narratives have really shifted. We saw with the UK climate compatibility checkpoint proposed a year or two ago that, one of the initial metrics they were trying to grapple with was the existence of the global production gap report, and kind of, all this other research building a case for why we need a rapid phase out starting now. And so I think that's really like at the frontiers, kind of translating these global reduction pathways into differentiated national trajectories. It's definitely something we've grappled with for years and years, and hopefully future forthcoming research. But we're trying to be a bit stronger in this year's PGR and have set out some concrete policy recs and reduction targets, but I can't tell you what the targets are, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ploy. And I think Kacper is gone, so Navrach, you are the target of that question by Alden about the cost.
Sure. Okay. So I answered this in the chat, but I think the question from Alda was around excise duties on fossil fuel producers to fund the transition. Are such taxes on producers being discussed in Europe? They're certainly not being discussed in the United Kingdom. There is no consideration of excise taxes on fossil fuel producers to fund a net zero transition. Of course, what is being discussed, well, it's not discussed, what's been enacted and what's being introduced at the European Union level is the CBAM, so a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So that's being brought into existence in a very tentative fashion right now. It will doubtless be challenged. I suspect those challenges will succeed, but that's as close as we're getting to that sort of trade measures taken at the border that Alden is referring to.
Thank you so much. And of course, one thing I can promise is that I obviously can't see what's going on in the chat. That's the beauty of in-person event. But yeah, I think if there are questions unanswered, we definitely will pass them on to research teams, and they won't be lost. Anyway, thank you so much. And that leads us with one agenda item left, which is basically a presentation by Sean Bradley, who heads the Secretariat of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. And we wanted Sean the reason we invited her to be the last presenter, because obviously BOGA has this intention of having ideally everybody, right, who is a major oil and gas producer there, and committing and so on. So could you just share with us your take on the international collaboration, those nuances between developing economies and so on? How do you see it from the perspective of being engaged with pretty much everybody on the planet who is contributing to the problem? And thanks for being here.
Well, first of all, thank you for having us. And yeah, dealing with everyone on the planet on these issues, it certainly feels that way this week. Look, I wanted to just start by saying, first of all, it's been an incredible week if we think about where we were this time last year. You know, we were heading into UNGA, you know, in the shadow of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with soaring energy and gas prices, and to be frank, real concern about the resilience of supply side action. And with the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, we have a small, rapidly growing alliance of first movers who are phasing out oil and gas, who are not only calling for it at the global level, but actually doing this really hard work at home that we heard about earlier. We saw the excellent presentation on the Danish case earlier. Every one of those governments came under really intense pressure last year. There were understandable questions about whether they would hold the line. And what we saw, of course, was these governments doubling down on their commitments, adding new members, and of course, the alliance really helping drive that rally, which resulted in over 80 governments coordinating and calling for the phase out of oil and gas ultimately. And I think it's fair to say this year, the phase out of fossil fuels and of oil and gas in particular has barely been out of the headlines, you know, and we've arrived here in New York with a really crystal clear ask from the UN Secretary General. The acceleration agenda is really, really clear. It emphasizes the need for oil and gas phase out. That's a shift. The Secretary General was not calling for that last year, but it's right there front and center this year. It reiterates the IEA's guidance on new oil and gas investments. It asks governments to phase down oil and gas production in line with the global goal of net zero by 2050. And the SG was really clear on the need for governments to come forwards and demonstrate action, concrete action, progress on plans. And we saw our subnational leaders, you know, Quebec, California, Washington State, really, really bringing that discussion to the floor on Wednesday. We saw Colombia once again showing up and demonstrating, you know, incredible political leadership and making clear the level of international support that is required for that transition, you know, the multilateral reforms that will be required to help them deliver on their plans. And we had the Marshall Islands, who joined us on Wednesday, our 21st member, talking about joining BOGA, applause to them, and lending their strength to, I quote, those courageous leaders who decide to leave their fossil fuels in the ground. And we saw the leaders' statement that the High Ambition Coalition published on Tuesday, and that was, you know, 18 heads of state calling for a transformation of global energy systems driven by the phase out of fossil fuels. So the politics around us, and I should also say, the COP president, not a member, but reiterating once again, you know, this inevitable and necessary phase out of fossil fuels, and that is important. So the politics around us are shifting quite rapidly, but the practical challenge of supporting these governments, you know, developing the analysis and the plans and the policies that can actually help deliver on that ambition and building the confidence of others to actually step forwards and engage in the debate. That work is still very much ahead of us. So this discussion here is really, really important. You know, I think, you know, it's good to be talking about the scale of the challenge, what implementation looks like in different contexts, and how we can all collectively support that. So on that note, what I would say is when Denmark and Costa Rica launched the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, I think the mission statement was pretty clear, right? It was about normalizing the concept of a managed phase out of oil and gas. It was about providing a platform for governments that are ready to set that ambition and set a clear pathway to a Paris-aligned phase out. And that was grounded in the IPCC scenarios, the IEA Net Zero report, which of course we have an updated version of next week, and the production gap reports, of course. And what we've been doing since is really building out an architecture that can begin to support governments in developing the plans and policies and mobilizing the finance required for a just transition, and, you know, creating that cycle of action and ambition and delivery. And that, of course, looks very, very different. And we've heard a number of high income, high capacity country examples today. And the question is, what next? How do other governments join that conversation? We realized really early on that even among our group of, small group of first movers, there was a huge amount of macroeconomic analysis, of legal advice that had to be undertaken before those governments could make a commitment. And many of these governments are not major producers We heard the case of Denmark earlier, largest producer in the EU, but not dependent in the way that many of the kind of developing economies with high levels of resource dependence are. Even in those contexts, a huge amount of government work, and it just isn't realistic to expect global South governments to be able to do that without dedicated support. And what we've seen happening at the multilateral level is, as public finance to the sector has quite rightly been pulled in recent years, a lot of the policy and the technical assistance that used to sit around the oil and gas sector, that's lifted and gone with it. So there's a real vacuum there in terms of advice and assistance. Over the past 3 or 4 years, we've seen a really rapid growth of support for just transitions, but it's very much focused on coal-dependent regions. It's framed in the language of sectoral pathways and territorial just transition plans, engagement with line ministries. But for major producers of oil and gas and exporters, this is a whole economy transition. It's not just an energy transition. And that means addressing the resilience of revenues over time, thinking about macroeconomic stability, implications for GDP, foreign exchange. It also means developing a vision of what a beyond oil and gas economy looks like. What are the inclusive, sustainable, resilient sectors that can really drive that transition? And I think collectively, we've been great at telling this story of risk and stranded assets, and we haven't quite been as strong on what that future looks like and where to invest in. So that's one issue and one real barrier. There's also the political sensitivity of this. So it is still, it takes serious courage for a government to step forwards. And, a government like Colombia, for instance, to step forwards and ask questions about the resilience of their revenues and the model. And we should be commending them and celebrating them for that. And we should be framing this discussion in terms of economic responsibility. Governments should be able to raise those questions, about their future pathways and risks without fear of an immediate loss of economic confidence. And we're not there yet. We really need to be building that narrative proactively. And, some of the comments on the previous panel about, loss of revenues and challenges with industry, I think that really, really speaks to the challenge. And the greater the dependence, the greater the challenge. And the third issue is just this real difficulty. I mean, Ploy, you touched on it just now, of defining Paris-aligned pathways for oil and gas production. So we know what the credible global scenarios look like. We don't fully understand how that plays out at this stage for different producers, depending on their scale and their stage of production, their level of diversification, their capacity to manage the transition. And the issue is that if you don't have a credible Paris-aligned pathway for the sector, it's very difficult to secure finance in transition, including for the really urgent upstream emissions reductions and methane action. You can't bring these projects to the boards of MDBs without a very visible demonstration of how the sector is on a Paris-aligned pathway. And we're not there yet on that work. So for this reason, we worked with our philanthropic partners to develop a $10 million fund to support governments in doing exactly this kind of work. So it's designed to support, provide quick, flexible support to underpin the analytical and the policy and the technical work that global South governments need to engage in this transition and to begin building the confidence and the capacity to engage with this discussion and start proactively managing the risks around oil and gas dependence, and to start thinking about and planning for an orderly managed transition. And we've built this out really, really carefully. You asked a question about collaboration. It's not just between countries, it is across the system. It's a systemic challenge. And so we've been in extensive consultation with the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, and other key parts of the economic and energy architecture. And we launched this fund at the IMF alongside the World Bank IMF spring meetings back in April. And just to give you a sense of the discussion, we had an OPEC member and a small island state sitting side by side, talking, in complete agreement about the urgency of, active support for just transitions from oil and gas. And we had MDBs around the table talking about, acknowledging the gap in assistance and discussing how they could come in support of next steps. And I think that's a significant step forwards, identifying and define the problem, and let's start actually working together on it as, with government leaders, but also with those key parts of the international system that need to come together and really support this challenge. So with the first call for expressions of interest, we launched it in April, closed it in June. We're already oversubscribed. That shows how much demand there is for practical support and collaboration. We are currently working very extensively with a number of governments on proposals. I'm hopeful that we have some announcements at COP on this. And maybe this time next year, we can have 3 Global South governments explaining, sitting on this stage and talking about their vision, their needs, and how they're approaching this challenge, because it will look very different to this. And we really need that diversity of views. So on that note, I think there's a real question for this community, this amazing group of people here today and online. How do we get that exchange going? And how do we build that community of practice and get some of this great work that is going on in universities and in think tanks? How do we get it out and applied? So those of you thinking about legal and regulatory issues, challenges that first mover governments are beginning to face from the industry, those of you who are working to better understand the economic costs and benefits of a managed orderly phase out, we need all of you here. And I think it would be really, really good to hear your comments and suggestions on how we collaborate, because we definitely can't do this alone. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm really glad that you mentioned this vacuum and your new fund, because that also that just demonstrates that things are moving rapidly, right, on your end. We also see at Climate Strategies and our partners the need for this neutral, safe space, right, for some of the conversations. So I think, as I mentioned, we would like also to continue, and I think we can mention that we've been discussing several potential joint initiatives, because one thing is to government, there's a certain, I guess, official dimension to that, right? But also I think people need to almost open up. And I think everybody, even the most sort of polluting stakeholder, would open up and just think of different scenarios, right? That are not in the official script, right? But we need to create that atmosphere and bring, maybe bring some analytical minds to, to just help with that imagination and scenarios and so on. So thank you so much for that. I think we have literally 2-3 minutes. Adriana is signaling that there is a question from the audience, so online. So please, if we can read it out.
Yes, apologies for those here, but we can also have some Q&A with Shan and the other speakers in the room at the end of the official event. So hopefully it's okay. I have a question from Lucas Slotos from the University of Sussex, and he's asking, the Danish government has recently awarded a so-called gas mini-round license to Blue North. There seems to be a clear contradiction between professing climate leadership on moving beyond gas while allowing new exploration to go ahead. What does this mean for Denmark's legitimacy as a tenable leader of BOGA?
No, it's a good question. And look, I mean, I think as co-chair of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, Denmark has made very clear its direction of travel on oil and gas production, cancelling all future licensing rounds, setting an end date for production at home, and leading a campaign for this globally. Despite this, an operator has made an application for an exploration license for an area that has been explored since the 1970s, with no commercial discovery yielded to date. That request was made under one of 2 mechanisms that was left in the North Sea Agreement that has been published in public since 2020, that was left in place for market stability. And due to EU regulation, that has in turn triggered a mini licensing round. So it wasn't voluntarily offered. It's a regulatory requirement that's been triggered here. And I think ultimately, it demonstrates how hard it is for governments to plan for a managed orderly phase out of oil and gas production. Governments don't join BOGA because they've got everything right. They join it because it's really, really hard work. And if that is the best sort of practice, the best in class legislation, and there is still an ability for an operator to try and trigger a clause and access an exploration license, that suggests that we still have learning to do. And so we have legal and regulatory issues working group. BOGA is at this point the first and the only alliance of governments that is committed to working on this difficult work and to learning from one another's experience and building that community of practice that can really improve the supply side regulation over time. And I think the more governments that come forwards and join those first movers and help build that evidence base and that understanding and experience, the easier that work becomes and the faster we can end our dependency on oil and gas.
And I guess it just demonstrates that nobody's a saint here, right? It means, same the countries that appear, the greatest leaders have their problems, and probably equally the most troublemakers are not only bad, right? There are some probably promising developments there and people who are progressive. So anyway, with that, I want to thank you, Sean, for your presentation. And this comes as promised to, we are ending the event on time, even a minute or two ahead of schedule. So first of all, one thing I want to acknowledge, I want to thank Adriana from Climate Strategies team. You've been a star in putting the event together. Thank you so much. And equally, Ploy, thank you so much also for your contribution from the SEI side. Thanks very much again for all the partners who have worked with us over 2-3 years. Thanks for the audience, people in the room. Thank you so much. And as I said, it's not the end. Sorry.
And Stanley Center also for supporting the coordination of the event on site today.
Absolutely. Stanley Center, thank you so much, as well as Laudus and KR who have been supporting us for over 2 years. And as I said, this is not the end. It's end of one chapter. We hope to continue. And now I'm inviting you, well, there's no extra drinks or reception, but you have still the existing fruit and snacks and coffee, tea. So hope we can network, and I see you again in the coming months, weeks, wherever we are. Probably some of you, I'm sure, will meet at COP28. Thank you so much again. Have a lovely day and weekend.